From lowly governess to scandalous mistress to royal wife, this is the incredible life of Katherine Swynford, a woman who was called a she-devil and enchantress and who managed to climb, or rather sleep, her way from the bottom to the top, becoming the third wife of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the second Lady of England, and the ancestor of the Tudor dynasty. Hers is a story where fact truly is stranger than fiction at times, and in today's episode of History Calling, I'm going to share all the juicy details with you. A quick note on images and sources first. There are almost no pictures of Katherine, so I've had to improvise for this video and use generic pictures of medieval women and also some AI pictures, otherwise you'd have had very little to look at. One of my secondary sources for this video is a book on Katherine by Jeanette Lucraft, which I've left linked below for you if you're interested, and which I'll also be providing a review of this week for my historical figure and time traveller patrons over on my Patreon site. I'll leave that link too if you'd like to think about joining for this and many other History Calling bonuses. I now have over 350 posts there, so biased though I am, I think you can certainly get your money's worth out of it even if you join at the lowest tier. Katherine was born Katherine Roet in around 1345 to 1350 and was the daughter of Gilles or Pont Roet from Rue in Hainaut. He had come to England with Philippa of Hainaut for her marriage to Edward III, which occurred in 1328, and was soon knighted by the English king, though it is worth noting that he was back in France between 1350 and 1352 for unknown reasons. We know nothing about Katherine's mother, not even her nationality, but the girl had an older sister called Isabel or Elizabeth, who became a nun and died in 1367, and possibly a brother called Walter. There was also definitely another sister called Philippa, born in around 1345 to 7. She would end up in the service of Queen Philippa no later than 1366, and ultimately married none other than famed English author Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote the Canterbury Tales, making him and Katherine brother and sister-in-law. Katherine could have been born in either England or France. Lucraft wonders if she was born in around 1345, making her older than her sister Philippa, and therefore definitely an Englishwoman by birth, as this would coincide with her father's time in that country, but we just don't know. In fact, we know frustratingly little about her early life. What I can tell you from the French chronicler Jean Froissart, who was working in Queen Philippa's household in the 1360s, is that sometime in or after 1359 she was placed in the household of Blanche of Lancaster, first wife of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, who was the third son of Edward III and Queen Philippa. He was also Katherine's future husband, though no one could have guessed that yet. Lucraft speculates that she had already been living at court before that, having possibly been placed in the care of the Queen when her father returned to France, and says that this upbringing would have afforded Katherine a comfortable existence and an excellent education, including reading, writing, music, dance, sewing, and of course religious instruction. The girl seems to have taken this seriously, as the first contemporary report we have of her at court is a document from 1365 stating that this servant of the Duchess of Lancaster could hear Mass privately. 11 years later, she would receive permission from the Pope to have a portable altar to travel with, again suggesting a degree of genuine piety, however much that might seem at odds with other aspects of her life. By the mid-1360s, she was already married to Sir Hugh Swineford of Colby and Kettlethorpe in Lincolnshire, who was an employee of John of Gaunt's. She presumably spent some time at his estates in that county, which were apparently no great shakes, according to contemporary descriptions of them, which said that they were run down, stony, and prone to flooding. The fact that she did not marry better leads Lucraft to speculate that perhaps this was a marriage based on affection, for she feels that the Lancasters, who evidently liked Katherine based on later events, would not have married her off to a relatively lowly knight like Hugh had it been against her will. Her son Thomas was born on the 21st of September 1368, though the birth date of her daughter, named Blanche after the Duchess of Lancaster, is unknown, but the child's godfather was John of Gaunt. Despite being a married mother of two, Catherine's days at court were far from over, and somewhere between 1366 and 1370 she was appointed governess to John of Gaunt and Duchess Blanche's daughters, Philippa and Elizabeth of Lancaster. This indicates not just her high standing with Gaunt, but also that she must have been considered an intelligent and sensible woman who could be trusted with such a charge. The Duchess herself died in September 1368. On the 13th of November 1371, Catherine's husband also died whilst fighting in Aquitaine, and within months she was the mistress of John of Gaunt, from whom she began receiving unusually generous grants in the spring of 1372. There is no reason to think the affair started before that. This is the time both would state it began in later documents sent to the Pope, and Gaunt wasn't in England between the summer of 1370 and late 1371. Despite the deaths of Blanche and Hugh, however, Katherine and Gaunt were still committing adultery, for he had remarried to Constance of Castile on the 21st of September 1371. We don't know what the new Duchess of Lancaster, who was presented as the rightful Queen of Castile by her husband, though she never successfully held the throne, thought of the other woman in his life, but it's interesting that John and Constance's daughter was named Kathryn. The affair was common knowledge at court by the mid-1370s, with Kathryn referred to in documents as John's mistress and used as a channel for royal patronage, albeit rarely. One reason their relationship couldn't be hidden was that the widowed Lady Swineford, who was still the governess to Gaunt's legitimate daughters, was continuing to have children herself. The dates of birth of these children are disputed, but the eldest, named John, seems to have been born in about 1373. His Oxford Dictionary of National Biography entry gives 1371, but this makes no sense given that his parents' relationship seems to have only started the following year, and there was never any question over his paternity even though Hugh Swinford was still alive in 1371. Next, there was a son named Henry, born in about 1375, then a boy named Thomas in around 1377, and yes, that is in addition to the son called Thomas Swinford that Katherine already had. Finally, there was a daughter Joan in roughly 1379. All these birth dates are according to the Oxford DMB. The children were given the surname Beaufort after a French lordship Gaunt had previously held, but lost in 1369, and through John Beaufort, Katherine and Gaunt were the ancestors of Henry VII, who would take the throne after the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. If you'd like to learn more about your own family tree, by the way, and have Irish ancestry, I'll leave my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, linked below for you. It's available from Amazon as both a paperback and an ebook. Sometimes Katherine and John were at court in London, sometimes they were at Catherine's home at Kettlethorpe, where her sister Philippa Chaucer was also living with her in the later 1370s. Given the nature of her relationship with Gaunt, Katherine was not popular in some quarters. Simon Walker, writing in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, notes that in February 1377 she had a grant of the manors of Gringley and Wheatley, Nottinghamshire, worth more than £150 per annum from the Duke. Such public acknowledgement of Catherine's position and the slight to Gaunt's second wife, the Duchess Constance, that it implied, caused great scandal to contemporary chroniclers. One such chronicler was the monk Thomas Walsingham, who lived between about 1340 and 1422. He started to write his Chronica Maiora in about 1380, and in it he was deeply critical of John of Gaunt's behaviour. It is hardly surprising to find that he also took aim at Katherine in one section, saying that during a tour of England the couple supposedly undertook in 1378, and it's not mentioned in any other source, so there's a question mark over whether it really occurred or was really this public, condemnation then grew for his wicked and disgraceful behaviour, especially because he himself put aside respect for God's dread, deserted his military duties, rode around the country with the abominable temptress seen as Katherine, once called Swineford, holding her bridle in front of his own people, not only in the presence of his wife, but even with all his retainers looking on, in the most honoured towns of the kingdom. He made himself abominable in the eyes of God, and all people of the kingdom together all feared divine vengeance on the whole kingdom to be near. In another passage in the same chronicle, Walsingham states that after the peasants' revolt of 1381, during which the young Richard II was in danger of being overthrown, and Gaunt's London home, Savoy Palace, and its contents were destroyed by rioters, the Duke began to reassess his life and believed that he and those around him were being punished for his sins, one of which was his relationship with Kathryn. An additional chronicle written in the 1390s by Henry VII says much the same thing, and the Anonymal Chronicle said that Gaunt, quote, supposed that God wished to chastise him for the misdeeds and the evil life which he had for long led, namely in the sin of lechery, in which he had particularly associated with Dame Katherine Swynford, a she-devil and enchantress, and with many others in his wife's household, against the wish of God and the law of the Holy Church. Thus these chronicles claim that for these reasons Gaunt decided to part from Kathryn. There was indeed an apparent breakup in the early 1380s. Kathryn surrendered her post as royal governess, though her charges were now grown up, was given an annuity of 200 marks per annum for life, and documents were drawn up to ensure that she and her heirs would have no claims on John of Gaunt, and vice versa. There was also a reconciliation with Constance of Castile, which the Anonymal Chronicle describes by saying that after the peasants' revolt, during which Constance had fled to the north of England for her safety, the Lord de Neville escorted Gaunt to Allerton, where the Duchess met him with a fine company from her household. When she saw her lord inside the Bishop of Durham's manor, she dismounted her horse and lay prostrate on the ground, close to fainting. This happened 3 times before she came to the Duke. The last time the Duke took the lady by the hand and kissed her. Both implored that all the circumstances between them should be forgiven, and the Duke graciously begged forgiveness for his wrongdoing towards her. She pardoned him readily, and there was great joy and happiness between them and their company the following day and night. It appeared that the scandalous royal love affair between Gaunt and Kathryn had run its course. If so, however, then it was all remarkably amicable. Kathryn still lent John money when he needed it. He was repaying her 500 marks in 1386–87, and in between stints on her Lincolnshire estates and in the town of Lincoln itself, she still made trips to court and received New Year's gifts from the Duke's daughter-in-law, the Countess of Derby, and stayed with another daughter-in-law, Mary de Bohun, wife of Gaunt's son, the future Henry IV, in 1387. It was also in that year that Philippa Chaucer died. Walker speculates that despite Gaunt's public reconciliation with his wife, who he needed for her claim to the throne of Castile, which allowed him to claim to be its king in her right, the affair with Kathryn was continuing, albeit more discreetly. Perhaps discretion was the idea, but if so, it eventually fell by the wayside. There were gifts of expensive rings and damasks to Lady Swineford, paid for by the Duchy of Lancaster in the early 1390s, and Kathryn and her 4 children by Gaunt were in his household in 1391, where 12d per day was allotted for her upkeep and 6d for each of their sons and daughter. Both she and Constance were present at ceremonies to do with the Order of the Garter as well, in 1388, 1389 and 1390, though Constance ended up living primarily in Leicester Castle after 1389, when it became clear to her husband that she could not be used to gain Castile for him, and where the 2 women would of course not have to interact. All that being said, it's interesting that there were no further Beaufort children during the 1380s, which might suggest that Kathryn and John weren't actually spending that much time together, or at least not sleeping together anymore. What happened next, though, was still extraordinarily scandalous. On the 25th of March, 1394, Constance of Castile died, leaving John of Gaunt free to marry once more. The strategic thing to do would have been to wed another foreign princess who could bring him power, money, and prestige. Instead, 2 years later, the now ailing Gaunt opted to marry Kathryn in Lincoln Cathedral in February 1396, making her at last the Duchess of Lancaster. Such a turn of events was and is incredibly rare. I can only think of 4 other instances of a senior English royal marrying his mistress, excluding Edward VIII, who only married Wallis Simpson after he'd abdicated the throne. These are Henry VIII, whose second, third and fifth wives had all been his mistresses prior to their weddings, and Charles III's marriage to Queen Camilla. None had already had children though, and all produced varying degrees of scandal. In the 14th century, jaws absolutely dropped at such a union. The author of An English Chronicle of the Reigns of Richard II, Henry IV, Henry V and Henry VI said that the which wedding caused many a man's wondering, for it was said he had hold her long before. In other words, why marry her when she's already slept with you? Never mind the fact that she'd been the governess. French chronicler Jean Froissart wrote about this turn of events at length, saying, "Out of love for his children, the Duke of Lancaster married their mother, Madame Katherine de Roet, which caused much astonishment in France and England, for she was of humble birth compared to the other two ladies, Duchess Blanche and Duchess Constance, whom the Duke had had as his wives before her." When the news of this marriage to Katherine de Roet reached the great ladies of England, such as the Duchess of Gloucester, the Countess of Derby, the Countess of Arundel, and other ladies with royal blood in their veins, they were surprised and shocked, considering it scandalous, and said, "The Duke of Lancaster has quite disgraced himself by marrying his concubine, and since she has got so far, it will mean that she will rank as the second lady in England. What a disgraceful reception for the new Queen of England when she comes." They went on to say, "We will leave her to do the honours all by herself. We will not go to any place where she may be. It would really demean us too much if that kind of duchess, who comes of humble stock and was the Duke's concubine for a very long time, inside and outside his marriage, were to take precedence over us. Our hearts would burst with vexation, and rightly so." Now, Froissart, you'll recall, had been in England in the 1360s working for Queen Philippa and probably came across Katherine then, but he never witnessed her relationship with Gaunt, and his account of that relationship and their marriage is riddled with known errors. For instance, a little earlier in the passage, he got the number of their children wrong and confused those children's biographical details. He also made a mistake in stating that the Countess of Derby was annoyed at the union, as there was no Countess of Derby in 1396. Still, Lucraft feels, and I agree, that his account of the reaction to the wedding was, quote, "accurate in tone if not in detail, and that it was Catherine's comparatively low birth which was the major sticking point, perhaps even more so than her previous role as royal mistress." The romantics among us might say that John married Katherine out of love for his former mistress, but in that case, why did he not marry her after Blanche died, or at least more quickly after Constance's death? Although he was in Aquitaine between November 1394 and the end of 1395, Constance had died in March 1394, remember, so there was a window during which he could have remarried before leaving England. I think that while there must certainly have been some real affection for Katherine, Froissart is closer to the reality when he states that John did this largely for his children. He had always doted on them and showered them with gifts and favours, raising them as very much part of the wider royal family, so much so that even Catherine's son Thomas Swineford was deep in the fold, for he was one of Henry IV's closest friends, Henry being Gaunt's eldest legitimate son, remember. Once Katherine was the Duchess of Lancaster, the Pope was prevailed upon to take the extraordinary step of retroactively legitimising the Beauforts, despite the fact that their illegitimacy was absolutely beyond doubt. A royal patent in Parliament in February 1397 did the same. Initially, this would even have allowed them a place in the line of succession, but a decade later, Henry IV, who otherwise got along very well with his Beaufort half-siblings by the way, added a clause to it to remove such a claim. This little addition wasn't ratified by Parliament though, so it arguably didn't count, and that is a whole other argument that we're not going to get into. In which case, we might say that Henry VII, though certainly from an illegitimate line, wasn't legally barred from the throne because of it. Lucraft also makes the excellent point that the Beaufort line ended up on the English and Scottish thrones in other ways too. Edward IV, Edward V and Richard III were all descended from Beauforts, as were the Scottish Stuart family after the marriage of Catherine's granddaughter Joan Beaufort to James I. Quite aside from the legal quagmire around the succession that the retroactive legitimisation of her Beaufort children caused, I have to say that I find the whole practice of legitimising children born prior to their parents' marriage and while one parent was married elsewhere to be ridiculous anyway. It just shows that the so-called rules really only applied if you didn't have the parent money to buy an exemption. You might think nothing so preposterous would happen in the modern era, but does anyone remember when Princess Caroline of Monaco was able to get her first marriage annulled in 1992, having already obtained a civil divorce, remarried elsewhere, and been widowed? This allowed her children from her second and eventually third unions to be considered legitimate and in line for the Monegasque succession, something which was important for a long time because her brother didn't marry and produce an heir until the 2010s. As far as I can tell, the annulment was allowed simply because she and her first husband didn't have any children, which I find just as daft as the Katherine and Gaunt situation. That pair were engaged in adultery for many years, and their children were illegitimate. It's just insane to me that they were ever allowed to pretend otherwise, and that other people were forced to go along with this complete denial of reality. Bear in mind that John's surviving child from his marriage to Constance of Castile, who was herself now the Queen Consort of Castile, by the way, was not declared illegitimate. So we're left with the situation that he was somehow having legitimate children with two different women while both of those women were alive and he was living in a country where polygamy was illegal. It just makes a mockery of the whole institution of marriage that the church was claiming was so sacrosanct and saying it protected so vigilantly, and it's really a case of him wanting to have his cake and eat it too. It would have been easier to just recognise the rights of illegitimate children as we do today, and I have to wonder, did they all really believe that God was fooled by this pack of lies they were spinning? I don't know, but let's move on. Katherine was now briefly the First Lady of England, for King Richard's mother, Joan of Kent, and his first wife, Anne of Bohemia, were both dead, as were the wives of Edward III's second son, the Duke of Clarence, who could otherwise have outranked her. This position didn't last long, as the king remarried to the 6-year-old Isabella of France in November 1396, and just as the other ladies of the land had apparently suspected, the new little queen was indeed escorted to England by this former royal mistress. Chaucer praised her abilities in the role as the now second lady of the kingdom and her feelings towards her husband, saying, "She had a perfect knowledge of court etiquette because she had been brought up in it continually since her youth. She loved the Duke of Lancaster and the children she had with him, and she showed it in life and death." Her time as Gaunt's wife was brief, for he died in 1399 and was buried with his first wife in Old St. Paul's Cathedral, which I find rather telling. It was the respectable Blanche, mother of his eldest and undoubtedly legitimate children and his heir, with whom he was placed. I'm not aware of any talk of him being buried somewhere where Katherine could later join him. Their tomb was sadly destroyed when that cathedral burnt to the ground during the Great Fire of London, and I have a video on the history of that building which I'll link on screen and below for you. As for Katherine, he left his most dear wife, as she was called in his will, generous dower lands to provide her with an income, and all the buckles, rings, diamonds, and other things that would be found in a little box of cypress wood to which he himself had the key. The Dowager Duchess of Lancaster returned to Lincolnshire, where she rented a house belonging to the cathedral there, and she stayed on good terms with her nephew Richard II and with her stepson Henry IV, after he seized the throne in 1399. Neither king took her lands from her, and Henry called her the king's mother, though he was actually the son of Blanche of Lancaster. There is an unsubstantiated rumour that she married again, but Lucraft dismisses this, noting that there would be far more evidence of it, like changes to Catherine's income to reflect the fact that she was no longer a widow, if it was true. Also, I have to say that it would have been crazy for someone at her stage of life and with her money to marry again and place all her belongings back under the control of a husband. Katherine Swynford, Duchess of Lancaster, died in 1403. She either left no will or it has not survived to us. She was interred in Lincoln Cathedral, where her epitaph reads, and this is a translation from the Latin original, Here lies Dame Katherine, Duchess of Lancaster, third wife of the very noble and very gracious Prince John, Duke of Lancaster, son of the very noble King Edward III. The which Katherine died the 10th day of May, the year of our grace, 1403, on which our Lord have mercy. Amen. There was no mention of her first husband, by whose surname she is still best known today, or of her unusual route to becoming a royal duchess. In death, Katherine was presented as a pious, respectable lady of impeccable social standing. Though the epitaph did not reflect it, Katherine's had been an extraordinary life. No one could have guessed that one of the younger children of an immigrant French knight could have risen to become the Duchess of Lancaster, and it was a coup indeed to even see her children by John of Gaunt legitimised, when they were clearly born as the result of an adulterous affair. It was a scandal at the time, but the true ramifications of Katherine's actions would only become clear over 80 years after her death, when the descendant of one of these children, Henry Tudor, would take the throne. Had Katherine and Gaunt not started their infamous relationship and later married and obtained at least a semblance of legitimacy for their children, how different history would have been. It is unfortunate that we have no letters written by Katherine or documents which can give us a reliable insight into her personality, so that all we can do to try to understand what type of person she was is extrapolate from her known deeds. To finish up, therefore, that's what I'm going to try to do. I'll tell you what I think of her character, with the proviso that these are just suppositions and shouldn't be taken as historical fact. We know that Katherine publicly expressed a great interest in religion and made numerous bequests to churches, most especially that in Lincoln, where she lived sometimes in houses in its grounds and was ultimately married for the second time and buried. She was particularly interested in Saint Catherine of Alexandria, perhaps because of their shared name and the fact that the saint was associated with royalty, and even had 3 Catherine wheels on her armorial. Yet we also know that this woman engaged in a long-term affair with a married man and had 4 children by him. These 2 facts don't really square with each other, though it's a common set of circumstances actually, which we see replicated in the lives of many other people throughout history. Just look at Henry VIII, for instance, and his daughter Mary, who both proclaimed themselves devout Catholics, but he was a serial adulterer and wife-killer, and she was burning people at the stake and having a blameless 16-year-old, Lady Jane Grey, executed. But back to Katherine. How could she be supposedly pious, yet act in such a way? To me, it suggests a complex person, able to compartmentalise her behaviour, and perhaps relying on the practice of confession and absolution to keep wiping the slate clean and soothe any misgivings she had over the hypocrisy of her actions and the fate of her soul. Either that, or she was an atheist who was just faking her piety, which is extremely unlikely. There's certainly no evidence that John of Gaunt was forcing her hand with this affair, so at the very least, I think we can rule that out. Her long-term liaison with the married Duke is one of the less attractive aspects of her conduct, and his, and suggests an unpleasant streak in her personality. Yet great men having mistresses was considered quite normal at the time, and probably not viewed with the same disdain that it would generate now. I also think that Katherine must have been a great conversationalist and a real charmer. Not only did she hold Gaunt's attention for decades, she also got along well with her lover's children by his first wife, and later on their spouses. This is no mean feat and suggests a flair for diplomacy and an attractive personality. The fact that she was able to continue a good relationship with Richard II and Henry IV, 2 kings who hated each other, suggests the same. Even those chroniclers who criticise her cite no specific incidents of her behaving poorly, involving herself in politics, or being financially grasping and injuring the people of England in that way. Her affair with Gaunt was disreputable, of course, but it seems that she knew how to conduct herself in company and at court, and was easy to like when you met her in person. I'm curious to hear what you think of her, though. Do you like her or loathe her? Let me know below, and if you've enjoyed this video, please remember to like it and subscribe to the channel for more from me. For another story of a medieval royal lady with a scandalous marital history, see my video on Katherine's contemporary, Joan of Kent, Princess of Wales, the mother of Richard II. I look forward to reading your thoughts on Katherine, and until next time, keep learning.